They weren't given enough rifles, so they turned their shovels into blades. In World War II, some of the most dangerous weapons never came from a factory. They came from desperation and the minds of soldiers who knew they couldn't wait for supplies to survive. With enemy lines closing in, with bunkers collapsing and cities on fire, they reached for what was already in their hands. Cans, soap, wires, boots, oil, cloth, and bone. And from those scraps, they made weapons. Not gadgets, not gear, but tools of resistance so effective, some were banned after the war. Others were hidden, buried in silence, shared only in whispers from one fighter to the next. They weren't trained for this. They were forced into it. Because when everything broke, and nothing came to help, survival meant turning the ordinary into the unthinkable. In this video, you'll discover 9 unusual weapon hacks World War II soldiers made from everyday items, and how those same methods could still save your life when nothing else can. Hit like and subscribe to rediscover the skills our ancestors never wanted us to forget. Number 1, the sharpened shovel. In the frozen trenches of the Eastern Front, the enemy didn't always come from a distance. Sometimes they were close enough to hear breathing, close enough to strike with your hands. And in those moments, when bullets ran dry and rifles jammed in the cold, Soviet soldiers reached not for a bayonet, but for their shovel. Issued as standard entrenching tools, these short-handled spades were meant for digging foxholes and clearing debris. But in the field, they became something far more brutal. Soldiers began sharpening the edges, filing them down with rocks, scrap metal, or the back of a blade, until they could split ice or bone. They didn't look like weapons. That was the point. A shovel was quiet, unassuming, but in trained hands, it was a killing tool. Used in ambushes, night raids, and close-quarters combat, it struck silently, without a shot, without a sound. And in muddy, cramped trenches where rifles were useless at arm's length, the sharpened shovel often meant the difference between life and death. It wasn't just the Soviets. German troops quickly adopted the same method. In the bitter winters of 1942 and 1943, entire units were trained to fight with their spades, practicing swings, blocks, and stabs in the snow. Some models were even manufactured with pre-sharpened edges, disguised as tools but intended for war. The blade could split a skull. The point could pierce a chest. And when the fight was over, it could still dig a grave. What made this weapon so dangerous wasn't just its shape. It was its silence. A gunshot gave away your position. A shovel did not. It left no flash, no echo. Just one more man standing, and one man gone. Even after the war, many soldiers kept their spades, not as souvenirs, but as symbols of what they survived. A reminder that in war, the most useful weapon is often the one no one expects. One forgotten skill. One more day alive. Number 2, Molotov's fire. It looked like a drink, but it burned like vengeance. In the bitter winter of 1939, as Soviet tanks rolled into Finnish villages, the defenders didn't have rockets or anti-tank guns. They had bottles, glass bottles, filled with fire. That was the birth of the Molotov cocktail. Named in bitter irony after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, who claimed the bombing of Finland was humanitarian aid, the Finns responded by bottling gasoline, stuffing the neck with a rag, and lighting it on the way to impact. The result was devastating. A single well-thrown bottle could force an entire tank crew to abandon ship. But it didn't stop with Finland. Across Europe, resistance fighters, trapped civilians, and even soldiers without munitions adopted the Molotov. The design was simple but deadly. A glass bottle, any shape, filled with flammable liquid. Gasoline worked best. But when that ran out, they mixed alcohol, kerosene, motor oil, even tar, anything that burned. The wick was usually cloth, soaked, twisted, and stuffed tight into the neck. Sometimes it was lit by match. Other times, it was soaked in phosphorus or mixed with sugar and potassium to ignite on impact. Thrown at tanks, it wasn't about penetration. It was about panic. The fire blinded periscopes, poured through engine vents, crawled across metal and under hatches. It forced the human inside to choose between burning or fleeing. In city streets, Molotovs were used against troop trucks and supply convoys. In forests, they lit ambush sites. On rooftops, they became bombs dropped from above, crashing through canvas, igniting ammunition, clearing escape paths. One bottle, one rag, one fire. The power wasn't just in the flame, it was in the fact that anyone could build it. No factory, no blueprint, just knowledge, just desperation. And when the war ended, this knowledge didn't vanish. It was passed in whispers, held in notebooks, carried across borders by those who knew that when oppression returns, so will the fire. Today, the Molotov still works, not because of its design, but because of what it represents. There was no plan B, only adaptation. Number 3, the sardine can trip mine. It didn't look like much a crushed sardine can, half buried in dirt, its edges smeared with grease. But in the right hands, it was enough to stop a patrol. In the war-torn hills of Italy and the back roads of Eastern Europe, partisans and resistance fighters had no access to grenades or claymores. But what they did have in bunkers, cellars, and ration crates were sardine tins, string, nails, and powder scraped from dismantled bullets. They built traps not for destruction, but for delay, for warning, for escape. The method was simple, but deadly in its precision. A used sardine can was flattened and hollowed out. Inside it, they'd place a few drops of oil or wax to protect the contents from moisture. Then came the heart of the trap, a tiny capsule of matchhead powder, scavenged gunpowder, or strike-anywhere phosphorus. This was packed with tension between bent nails or sharp springs, often stolen from clocks or toys. A tripwire was connected to a trigger pin, sometimes just a bent nail tied to a loop of wire. When pulled, the pin snapped loose, releasing the tension and igniting the powder inside the can. It wasn't a full explosion, not like a grenade, but it was loud enough, sharp enough, a crack of flame and metal that startled soldiers, spooked animals, and in the dark, caused just enough panic for a scout team to scatter. More importantly, it signaled movement. A soldier hiding in a rooftop could hear the crack of that sardine can from 20 meters away and know the enemy was coming. These weren't weapons of war. They were weapons of time. They bought 10 seconds, maybe 15, enough to grab a pack, slip out the back, hide the documents, or take the shot first. What made this so powerful wasn't the blast. It was the message. From food came a warning. From trash came defense. From nothing came one more chance. Even today, when the grid goes down and danger returns in silence, knowing how to build warning from waste may matter more than any app, alarm, or locked door. It's a method modern prepping still hasn't reclaimed. Number 4, the pen gun. It didn't fire bullets fast, it didn't reload, and it only worked once. But in the hands of the desperate, it was enough to kill. Inside Nazi prison camps and occupied cities, where guns were banned and searches were brutal, the resistance created something unthinkable: weapons hidden inside writing tools. They called it the pen gun. It looked like nothing, just a piece of pipe the size of a marker. Sometimes it really was a pen, gutted and rebuilt with parts stolen from radios, watches, or plumbing. A single barrel, one round, one shot. But that shot changed everything. Prisoners of war, trapped behind barbed wire and concrete, began crafting these crude firearms in secret, using hollowed metal tubes, springs, and nails for firing pins. They built weapons that could fit in a coat sleeve, small enough to pass a pat-down, strong enough to kill at arm's length. The mechanism was terrifyingly simple. A bullet, usually smuggled, traded, or stolen, was loaded into the tube. A spring-loaded pin was rigged behind it, held back with wire or even carved wood. And with one push, it fired. No safety, no sights, no second chance. But it didn't need one. Pen guns were used to kill guards, start escapes, and even capture full-sized weapons from surprise patrols. One shot, one soldier down. One real rifle in hand. Across Europe, variations appeared in Polish resistance cells, French sabotage teams, and even inside concentration camps where survivors whispered about the tube that barked. But perhaps the most haunting part was how quiet it all was. There was no factory, no plan, No blueprint, just a handful of parts, human ingenuity, and the will to fight back no matter the odds. Even after the war, governments studied these improvised weapons. Some banned their design entirely. Others adopted the method for undercover agents in Cold War espionage. But it started with prisoners, with the forgotten, with those who weren't supposed to survive and chose to anyway. Because when freedom was just one shot away, even a pen became a weapon. This wasn't just survival, it was memory, passed down in silence. Number 5, the nail bomb. In occupied Poland, bread wasn't just a ration, it was a disguise, a shield, a trap. As German convoys rolled through villages and resistance fighters found themselves outgunned, they needed more than courage. They needed weapons. But with every home searched, every barn raided, and every factory watched, carrying a grenade was a death sentence. So they built one inside a loaf of bread. The method was crude, but it worked. Homemade explosives were packed inside a hollowed crust gunpowder from stolen munitions, or chemicals scraped from farming supplies. Nails, screws, glass shards, even coins were pressed into the mix for maximum damage. The detonator? A simple friction fuse, sometimes made from match heads and wire, coiled tight and set to ignite on impact or by timer. To anyone passing by, it was just a sack of bread. To those who built it, it was justice waiting to be delivered. In Warsaw, underground fighters used bread bombs to sabotage rail lines and troop gatherings. In Greece, resistance cooks baked heavy loaves that never touched a table. Even in France, cafe workers delivered baskets of bread with one false loaf hiding enough force to tear through steel. These weren't random attacks. They were surgical, planned, carried out with full knowledge that if caught, torture or worse awaited. But the message was louder than the explosion. You will not walk our streets in peace. Even civilians, desperate to contribute, helped build them. Housewives dried powder near ovens. Children helped cut the fuse cords. Farmers offered nails. Priests hid them in delivery bags under the noses of patrols. And when they went off, there was no warning. Just fire, smoke, shattered control. What made this method terrifying wasn't the materials. It was the simplicity, the familiarity, the way it turned survival into resistance and resistance into fear. Because when bread becomes a weapon, no soldier feels safe. Today, it's a reminder of how far people will go when pushed to the edge, and how sometimes even the most nourishing thing in life is repurposed for war. Tech fails, but this method never did. Number 6, the booby-trapped piano. It sat in the corner of a ruined parlor, keys chipped, lid cracked, dust on the strings, and yet soldiers still touched it. In Nazi-occupied France, resistance fighters learned something terrifying. Curiosity kills, especially when your enemy believes the war is already won. So they used that arrogance and turned it into a weapon. They called it the last song. It started with abandoned homes. After families were taken or fled, many left behind the things they couldn't carry: chairs, pictures, mirrors, and pianos. German officers often used these empty houses as temporary posts, confident no threat could reach them. But resistance cells had other plans. They rigged the pianos, carefully, quietly. Explosives often homemade, sometimes British supplied, were hidden inside the hollow body. The trigger? A tripwire tied to the hammers or a pressure plate beneath a key? All it took was one curious press. One officer showing off. One soldier testing a tune. The explosion wasn't massive, but it didn't need to be. In a small room, the force was enough to kill anyone standing close. And the psychological damage was far worse. Soon, German troops started avoiding pianos. Some smashed them on sight. Others banned their men from touching anything that played music. The resistance had proven a point. Nothing was safe. Not even art. In some cases, they took it further, wiring radios, phonographs, even toy music boxes. anything nostalgic, anything beautiful, anything that whispered home. Because when the enemy lets his guard down in front of beauty, that's when you strike. What made this trick so chilling wasn't just its silence, it was its elegance. A tool of culture turned into an act of rebellion. A final note. That said, you will never feel safe among us again. And today, this method still holds a lesson. Not in how to kill, but in how to think. How to use what's already around you. How to turn weakness into precision, and how to survive by turning the forgotten into the feared. This wasn't just survival. It was memory, passed down in silence. Number 7, the graveyard cache. They never searched the graves. And that's exactly why the resistance used them. In the darkest years of World War II, when food was contraband, radios were criminal, and weapons meant death by firing squad, there was one place even the most brutal patrols avoided: cemeteries. Not because they were sacred, but because they were useless. Dead men didn't fight. Dead women didn't rebel. And so, soldiers stopped looking. But the resistance didn't. All across Eastern Europe, in Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, even inside Germany itself, fighters began to bury their survival beneath the gravestones, inside hollow crypts, under fake soil, between coffins, sometimes inside them. They called it ghost storage. Weapons wrapped in oilcloth, letters meant for London, bread, grain, salt, hidden inside urns, ammunition beneath crosses, even entire radio sets, disassembled, stored in boxes marked with forgotten names. The logic was simple. No one searches what they fear. Graveyards weren't just hiding places. They were maps. Fighters would mark tombstones with tiny scratches. 1 vertical line for food, 2 for weapons. A chipped corner meant it was safe to dig. Families protected these caches in silence. Gravekeepers turned their backs. Children were taught not to ask why certain plots were visited at night. It wasn't just resistance. It was survival, buried beneath the weight of death. In some towns, German officers even built barracks next to cemeteries, never realizing they were sleeping beside the enemy's supply chain. It wasn't just clever, it was genius. The kind of genius born when every other door has been nailed shut. And only the dead are left to trust. And today, in a world of drones, trackers, and digital surveillance, that mindset still matters. Not because we need to hide in graves, but because we need to think like those who did. When everything you have can be taken, the only thing that keeps you alive is what no one thinks to look for. This wasn't survival. It was defiance, buried 6 feet deep. One subscription helps revive the knowledge they died to preserve. Number 8, the burned map they stared at ash. And somehow, they still found the way. When escape meant life and capture meant death, resistance couriers across Nazi-occupied Europe faced an impossible question. How do you carry a map without carrying a map? 1 search, 1 pocket check, 1 slip, and it was over. So they created a method so clever, so final, that it became legend among underground fighters. The burned map. Here's how it worked. Couriers would take a standard hand-drawn map, trails, roads, safe houses, supply drops. They studied it until every line was etched into memory. Then, just before departure, they burned it. Not ripped, not hidden, burned. The ashes were kept in a pouch, bottle cap, or sewn inside a jacket cuff, not because they were useful, but because they proved nothing remained. But the real genius came before the fire. Some resistance cells developed a technique called layered encoding. They'd embed the map into memory by using rhymes, rhythms, and street sounds. Each bend in a road matched a syllable. Each turn, a word. A child's song in the back of the mind became a route to safety. Others used scent trails, marking trees or doorways with herbs like thyme, garlic, or vinegar-soaked cloth. These faded fast, but stayed just long enough to guide the next runner. When checked, the courier's clothes smelled like soup, nothing more. If caught, they had no map, no paper, no proof, just silence and memory. This wasn't survival by gear. It was survival by mind, a kind of preparation no tool could match. And when the war ended, many of these couriers never spoke of how they did it. Some had carried messages across 3 countries without ever writing a word. Others had memorized routes so well they could still walk them in old age, eyes closed. Today, we rely on GPS, digital maps, step-by-step instructions. But the moment power fails, so does our direction. This trick, the burned map, wasn't about fire. It was about independence. It's about knowing that when the world strips everything away, the only thing left is what you've stored inside your mind. Because the most dangerous knowledge is the kind no one can take from you. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 9. The razor boot. It looked like an old boot. Scuffed, muddy, ordinary, but the edge of the sole could slice skin and end a fight before it began. In the silent alleys of occupied Warsaw and the mountain passes of Yugoslavia, resistance fighters had no luxury of backup. Sometimes they didn't even have knives, but they had boots, and they turned them into weapons. The method was brutal and ingenious. They took razor blades, broken glass, or saw teeth, anything sharp, and embedded them into the toe or heel of their boots, fixed with wire, nails, or melted rubber. Then they blackened the metal with soot so it wouldn't reflect light. These boots weren't for walking. They were for ambush. A kick to the groin, a stomp to the thigh, one fast motion in close quarters, and the fight was over before it started. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't pretty, but it worked, especially when the enemy was armed and the fighter wasn't. Some wore them in public, passing checkpoints unnoticed. Others used them in dark basements where silence mattered more than style. In many cases, the blades weren't even discovered until the body was found. Because that was the point. This wasn't war by rules. It was war by survival. And when you're cornered with nothing but your shoes, even your footsteps become weapons. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Now you understand, these weren't just hacks. These weren't clever tricks for clicks or views. They were the final defense of people who had nothing left and still refused to fall. In World War II, survival wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was quiet, cold, and constant. It lived in the empty streets, the broken homes, the bloodied fingers folding cloth into rope, lighting fire from oil, pulling water from nothing. Each method you've seen, every can, every brick, every trap, wasn't invented for strategy. It was born from fear, from starvation, from the silence that follows after the last plane flies over, and the world forgets you exist. But they remembered, and because they remembered, and passed it down, hand to hand, whisper to whisper, we can remember too. We live in comfort now, but that comfort is temporary. The lights that stay on, the water that runs, the food that waits on shelves, none of it is guaranteed, and when the noise stops, the ones who'll survive won't be the ones who hoarded. They'll be the ones who prepared like the past still matters. Because it does. These forgotten methods aren't just survival, they're legacy. And if we don't keep them alive, no one will. Help bring these lessons back into our world. Subscribe and stay prepared.